It might feel like old news now, but the pandemic highlighted a need for dynamic, agile, and work orientated talent model. Today, we'll be exploring how human resources can play a part in both this and leadership in general. To help me explore this, I'm joined by Iwan de Leeuw. Iwan humbly refers to himself as a design thinking HR generalist, but as the Executive Vice President of People Development at Toll Group, he is responsible for people strategy, enabling HR business partners and the talent management function to operate efficiently and effectively. So I'm thrilled to welcome Iwan to In Good Company. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, how are you?
I'm great, and I should say thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. We start all our episodes with exactly the same question, which is to invite our guests to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Let me start by saying I'm a talker, so I'm not sure if 60 seconds is enough, but
Well, it has proved a challenge for most of our guests. I'll say that.
I bet. So, I mean, let me start by saying I didn't plan a thing in life, but honestly, I couldn't have planned it any better. I'm originally from the Netherlands. I've lived in a number of countries, including Japan, the US, Vietnam, and currently I reside in Singapore. I took a very unconventional path in life. So I went to school, but after that, I actually didn't go to university. I pursued a military career as an officer for a number of years, and then I saw the light. I went back to school, obtained my master's, and then I started pursuing a professional career. Although initially I thought about joining the diplomatic corps, but I quickly found out that it wasn't quite for me. So I pivoted once again, and by chance, I ended up in talent acquisition, or rather in a recruiting firm. I did that while I was in Japan, and that really started my career in HR. Again, I think that my life is littered with forks in the road. At some point, I relocated to the US, and then I actually started doing HR generalist roles, and that was about 20 years ago. Yep.
So for those, I was curious. So for those that don't know, you did very well, by the way, on your 60 seconds. I think you did extremely well. I was curious to kind of understand a little bit more about HR generalist and what that actually means for maybe myself and other people that maybe don't know.
Well, yeah, I think it's a really good question because these days that role doesn't quite exist anymore. But
Right.
10, 20, 30 years ago, HR people or HR managers, as most were called, they were doing a number of HR aspects, including potentially payroll, recruiting, learning and development, OD. But a number of years ago, people really started specializing in areas. So these days, you have people that work in COEs, like as comp and ben people, learning and development people, talent acquisition people, and then you have HR business partners that are even closer to the front line to really help develop long-term strategy and people strategies to help the business. So technically, the HR generalist does no longer exist. Okay. Although certain companies still have remnants of this, especially I think small and medium-sized companies, they probably still have generalists where an HR person would probably do the full gamut.
Okay, I understand now. Well, to kind of expand on your experience within that field,
sure.
We mentioned in the intro that the kind of topic of today is highlighting what the challenges and I suppose what we learned from the pandemic. And it, as I mentioned in the intro, it kind of does feel a long time ago, which is really strange because it's only 3 years ago since the first lockdown. And arguably, I suppose the pandemic was the biggest challenge in recent years that any sort of the planet has had to overcome, let alone people in organizations. I suppose moving on then, what are some of the biggest challenges that you think are facing HR professionals today, and how do you think they can be addressed?
Well, actually, one of the big challenges, which is actually a remnant of the COVID days, because once COVID hit and companies had to quickly pivot and sort of reinvent ways of working and people working from home, I think a lot of companies are still going back. And although we came out of COVID about, I guess, a year ago, or largely globally, but I think still a lot of companies are, figuring out how to get back to the ways of old, but
Yeah.
not completely to the ways of old, sort of like this ideal mix. And I don't think a lot of companies have actually figured it out yet. But that, I
Mm,
think, is an interesting problem to have. So that is one that is to me extremely obvious. But the other things, so that's a new dimension. But I think if you take a step back, then you start thinking like, what are the problems that still exist, or the challenges from an HR or human capital element that still exist? We're talking about, okay, how are people thinking about the employee value proposition? How are we re-engaging the workforce, and especially in this post-COVID situation? How do we
mm,
continue to attract talent, especially in this, where now people have gotten very used? I'm working from home. I want more of this. How do we bring them back and attract them into a company where companies potentially might want to bring people a little bit more into the office, right? Strengthening the manager or people leader and employee relationship, promoting talent mobility, especially in this post-COVID world. How do you build skills, retaining talent through better employee experiences? And then, of
mm,
course, I think that's on every chief HR officer's agenda. What am I doing in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging
mm.
topics? All that said, and I think all these things, they go back to fundamentals. So whatever you do in an HR profession, I think you need to go back to the fundamentals in terms of creating purpose for people and ultimately intrinsic value for the employee. If you do that well, a lot of the elements that I just mentioned, I think will be taken care of by themselves.
So could you
But
expand on maybe some of those fundamentals, just to kind of do a bit of a recap? What would you say are some of those top fundamentals that people need to focus on?
Well, quite frankly, who do you want to be in terms of HR, or rather, as a company, right? What is the offering that you want to give to your employees? I think
Mm,
it really starts with that. So that's one dynamic. The other is, especially in this day and age, where there's a lot of, we are going digital. Now AI is coming. And a lot of companies are, of course, and rightly so, very interested in all these developments, but they
mm,
actually need to be based on some core fundamentals. I mean, when I talk to colleagues, peers, I typically talk about, like, ideally you have a very good analog solution that is rock solid, and
yeah.
then let's do the extra part. But often people use technology and tools as a solution for that initial analog problem, and you don't quite solve it. And that's what I mean by, you need to go back to the fundamentals, to the root cause, really
Yeah.
focus on that. You do that well, the rest will be relatively easy.
I suppose it's uh, picking out the human of human resources, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, correct. No, no, absolutely, absolutely. And
Yeah.
for me, right, to go back in terms of fundamentals, and again, this is my interpretation of human resources. I mean, it can differ to other, for other practitioners, but
Mm,
I strongly believe in like certain values, right, and being very transparent with employees on what to expect. Because you do that, you'll always, in my view, you'll be very surprised what people will do for you. But if
mhm.
you're not very transparent in sort of what you try to achieve as a company, how you plan to treat your employees, I think that's going to come back to you a little bit, right? So that's what I'm saying. Fundamentals. I mean, we often go after the shiny things, but I
Mm.
think the fundamentals is actually what drives the 80%, and then the technology and all that is the extra icing on the cake, the 20%, to make it more efficient, quicker, more productive, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good insight. Thank you. I mean, we've kind of talked about how experienced you are in a little bit already, with over sort of 15 years experience. I'm curious to get your take on what you see as the role, or where do you see HR fitting in with the leadership of an organization? How can the input and influence of HR function define or sort of organizational success?
I think this is a wonderful question, because if you ask an HR practitioner, of course I'm going to say it's crucial for a number of reasons. But I
Yeah.
think technically you probably should ask this question to leadership teams in companies, because
Mm.
ultimately, to me, right, you can create all kinds of great products and we can automate it, but there still will be this human factor. So therefore, I'm going to always say, I think HR plays a crucial role in the leadership of an organization by helping people look beyond the horizon, what is coming, and how do we prepare our organization and our workforce what is coming next. I mean, I'm a staunch believer that HR or the HR function is a custodian of culture and leadership, and I think that's a really important one, especially in this day and age, employment risk, right? So I think together with the C level in an organization, HR practitioners are crafting and molding the culture that the organization ultimately wants to espouse, and I think that's critical because you want to set the tone at the top. If that is set well, then I think everything that flows from there can be aligned to a certain North Star, if you will. Right. So in that sense, I think in terms of HR as a facilitator actually of business processes, I
Mm,
often hear this is an HR process, this is what we need to do. But I actually disagree because we're just experts in certain fields, but ultimately these are intricate parts of the organization. So I typically make a point to people to say, no, 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 I'm a facilitator of a business process. I am not
yeah,
running an HR process, right? But you
the
often hear this
present.
expression, do people have a seat at the table, right?
Yeah.
And that depends a little bit on the organization, how they view HR. And, for many reasons, they can look at it differently. But I think
Mm.
ultimately the companies that really will succeed and with longevity, they have a very clear picture how to leverage the HR component to really understand, what is the true value that HR people can bring. And I think sometimes people see HR people as inhibitors of growth, people that say no to a lot of things. But from my vantage point, is like HR people, and together with some other functions in an organization, they look, as I said, they're custodians of risk. They bring a level of governance that is, I think, necessary for the organization to be very successful. And in my view, governance doesn't equate bureaucracy, but sometimes I think organizations are not quite on the same page. Right.
So in that case, then, how do you approach kind of developing HR vision and strategies that develop effective leaders and enhance organizational culture?
Well, I mean, I think it basically starts with, where is an organization? What is needed? Because there's so many good things that HR people could do in terms of development, but it all goes down a little bit. I mean, for me, we talk about strategy, and that's the long-term vision, and I think you definitely need to have that. But it starts often with creating habits in an organization that over time become practice and culture, and therefore it's easier for you to execute on a strategy. Now, I'm not saying that culture is an alternative. I think they go hand in hand, but in terms of developing HR strategy, again, I think I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about fundamentals. I think it's focusing on the fundamentals. How are the fundamentals done? And what is the organization willing to do in terms of the fundamentals? Because if you
Mm,
get that, you can actually craft an HR strategy. And quite frankly, an HR strategy should be aligned to a business strategy. What is the organization trying to focus on? Because if I don't have a clear understanding as an HR person on that, what is the strategy that I'm building? It will not
mm.
be connected. And that's a problem, right? Because anything you do in an HR organization should be to support the growth and the success of an organization. So your HR strategy needs to be aligned. But that said, I think you can still start, even without that alignment, you can start focusing initially on the fundamentals, on repeatable processes, on building strong foundations for the organization to continue to build on.
And with the kind of thinking about how to build those strategies, and I'm curious about I mean, in your experience, you've worked for multinational corporations. How how challenging is it to kind of align those strategies across different geographies and kind of a diverse range of cultures?
Well, I mean, I think that is absolutely that's a huge challenge, and it's not even the how do you align strategies across the geographies, right? But it even starts with how do you start with creating an initially aligned strategy. Because again, it
Yeah.
goes back to the business. So it starts with that, and if you can create that, I think you're ahead of the game. But I think, how do you ensure that things are, done the same in many geographies? I think ultimately, and I think this is the secret to to HR. Principally, if you look at how HR should be practiced, I mean, if you look at labor laws in many countries, the the objective that governments have in order to protect their workers or sort of create labor laws, they actually pursue the same, let's say, universal principles, if you will. Now, there are differences in many countries, but the underlying element is a little bit the same. So that actually helps you if you want to also expand a strategy, because you know that the foundation in many countries is roughly the same. I mean, there's differences, absolutely, but it's
Mm.
roughly the same. So,
Yeah.
I mean, for us, I mean, what I've been doing, especially in my current job, but even in jobs before that with other organizations, I mean, I've really tried to, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but it's okay. What are the fundamentals? And ideally, they're simple so people can understand them easily. They're standard so you can actually apply them in many countries, and they're global, right? And then
Mm.
in order to roll out, I mean, I think a lot of companies, and then this goes back to things like change management. People
Mm.
want to do, or rather, organizations want to do big bang events, and in my experience, it can be done, but it typically requires a long, period of preparation. And in this day and age, when things change so much, it's actually easier to roll things out in waves and learn as you go and adapt over time, right? And I think if you're open to the idea of like, okay, ideally, I'm going to create a solution that will probably do 80 or 85% of the trick, but I'm open to sort of tweak it here and there, whatever my strategy is, I'm okay with it. And in that sense, it's almost like a chess game. Like I can
Yeah.
think to 3 or 4 steps ahead, but I should be prepared for like a move that I didn't anticipate, and then be flexible enough to adjust to that.
I really like what you said there about the yes, there are diverse cultures and geographies that organizations operate in, but ultimately, whenever you join an organization, you are joining a certain type of culture, aren't you? You kind of you align yourself. You as an individual, you would align yourself in some way into the culture that you join. Um, and as you mentioned, the key similarity across any organization is that human element. You know, we are all human, and what I thought was particularly interesting in that front was, and this kind of goes back to the topic of today's episode, which is the pandemic was a massive leveler for people, I think, because we suddenly found ourselves, no matter who you spoke to in the world, you had something in common, like something more than you realize. You know, it's like the no matter what call you went on, particularly in those first sort of few months of lockdown, you were finding you were telling stories about how the pandemic affected you, and that was really you suddenly felt connected to anybody you spoke to, which was something we'd not necessarily experienced before. And I just found that very interesting.
And I think you're absolutely right. To me, and I love thinking in terms of analogies. And this might not be a really good one, actually, but if you think of it, I mean, like I have everybody these days probably has a cell phone, right? A mobile
Mm.
phone, and but these days is basically a mini computer. So I've gotten used to this over time because it was a gradual process. But when I was young, I mean, nobody had a cell phone, right? That was for extremely rich people. And again, it was, I think, the late 80s that this really became a thing, right?
Mm.
But if you think in the terms of this change, it literally came overnight. But the adaptability of people and the change, it was instant. And I think because it was such a landslide shift, getting back to that is going to be, I think, very difficult. I think the genie is not going to be, we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the box, which I find utterly fascinating. And it was because we're talking about cultures, right? Again, you see this universal thing because it's not something here, it's basically everywhere. Although in some countries, people are a little bit more successful in getting people back into the office. because of the culture in that particular
Yeah.
country. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's the interesting part, especially in HR. And again, if you go back to this early comment about strategies, you need to be very aware of those elements. The advantage you have is there's also this element of company culture that sort of adds as a, functions as a little bit of a, like icing on the cake, that enables you to push things a little bit further than you normally would have been able to in a country. And I think people that know how to leverage that well, they're going to be very successful
Yeah.
with their enterprises. Sorry, I just wanted
Absolutely. I
to
think
add
that,
that.
no, you're right, and I think that there's there seems these days there seems like a more of a, a it feels like companies are trying to blanket a global approach to a lot of things, but it's important, I think, to acknowledge and respect local cultures, and as we've talked about, uh, and a terminology that I've heard a bit recently, and actually came up in another episode that we recorded, which was the term glocal. So having the kind of approach, a global kind of over approach, but also acknowledging local kind of approaches to certain things as well, and cultures.
Oh, that's interesting that you say it, because that concept, right? Think global, act local. I mean, it's a well, I don't know how long this has been a thing in the business world, but it's at least 20, 30, 40 years old. And
Yeah.
if we go through these cycles where this, comes in vogue a little bit again, and I think this is coming in vogue again a little bit. And you're absolutely right. I think, and it's not just an HR thing. I think it's for any function or any business operation in a company that operates in multiple countries. Is you try to design something, right, that is sort of the, let me call it the, it's not the best way to describe this, but the lowest common denominator that that will work, right? And even if this lowest common denominator would trump a local legislation, still have the flexibility and the adaptability again in terms of the global aspect, as you said, to say, we know that we said this as a company, but actually in that country, they have something that actually requires us to do it different. We will follow that, because
Mm.
in this day and age, you need to be extremely compliant. But and having that flexibility, having that sort of cultural understanding, or even legal understanding, if you will, I think is vital for somebody to be successful, whether that's in HR or any type of role in an organization.
Mm. I wanted to pick you up on something that we talked briefly about earlier on, which is, and I know we've talked a lot about the fundamentals and being human, but I just want to get your take on AI, and how what potential challenges or not do you see with the kind of development of AI and technology?
I mean, I think actually it's a fascinating question. It provides a lot of AI technology. It provides a lot of opportunities, and of course a number of dangers. Although the dangers are just a matter of people, fearing what's going to happen next
Mm.
and not sure how they're going to be impacted. And I think this is the beauty of my job, because I think with the birth of HR and artificial intelligence and the opportunity of technology, will come all kinds of new opportunities and roles. It will
Mm.
actually make our lives better. I'm not just talking as an HR practitioner, but even employees. You just need to be in an environment that really embraces what technology can do for you. How do you make it work for you? Then it doesn't become so scary. I am
Yeah.
absolutely convinced certain jobs will never go away. And yes, we see very interesting developments in terms of Chat GPT, where you have chatbots that can literally write all kinds of things. But I still think in the end, yes, there will be a need for technology always. So if you're in that field, great. But the critical creative side, I'm convinced it will provide many, many opportunities. But even in the company I'm with at the moment, we're looking at this, trying to look over the horizon, what will work, what won't work,
Yeah.
experiment with the technology. And especially in one of our, I'm going to call it a daughter company, they have actually been extremely successful in really pushing their employees to sort of adopt technology, to truly embrace it and actually enhance what people do, because they can change their own future by saying, I'm going to leverage technology and actually create my new job. And I think if you think of it that way, it gives you tons of possibilities. If you think in terms of this is going to take my job away because it can be automated, yeah, then it's a frightening thing. But I think over time, and this has been going on for, decades, centuries. I mean,
Of
we
course, yeah.
constantly reinvent ourselves. So this is yet another phase, and I think other beautiful things will come. But yeah, if you don't have a clear path, I understand that people are a little bit nervous, right?
Well, and the same conversation will undoubtedly have happened when with the birth of the internet, I'm sure.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. Yeah,
So we're
absolutely,
probably just
absolutely.
at that stage. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
well, moving on slightly then, we wanted to kind of talk to you about trust. We've recently done some research with over 500 global CEOs and senior executives, and that research gave us the number one driver of people engagement and retention is trust. I want to find out, first of all, how does that resonate with you from an HR perspective, and in, how do you build that culture of trust with key stakeholders?
So I'm going to probably talk from a personal perspective first, if you don't mind, because for me, right, I really my one of my personal values is transparency, right? And I
Mm,
mean, to me, it's really closely linked to elements like trust. So for me, being transparent is very important, and I think if you're being very transparent, right, you build trust naturally, right? Again, it's probably not as simple as I just laid out, but I think for me that's really critical. Then also like to think in terms of, well, definitions. I'm not going to define the word trust, but for me,
sure.
right, uh, one, trust is critical, as you say. I think it really is the foundation of relationships. The second step for me personally, and I have to say, I had to learn this over time. For me now, I say trust is given, it's not earned. But if you would have asked me probably 20, 25 years ago, I would have given you the opposite answer. But I think over time, I realized this actually unlocks people. And if you put your faith in people, you will be amazed what happens. So trust, transparency, and communication. I think that's some kind of like holy trinity that if you do that well, you'll simply be amazed. I think as organizations, and sometimes even as HR professionals, we sometimes underestimate what our employees are willing to do, what they're capable of doing. So if you set them free, and I think it starts with this element of trust, I think you're gonna see organizations soar. But I think in terms of organization, and I understand why, because there's of course always this element. I need to mitigate risk. I need to govern things. So people tend to be careful. But I think if you do it within certain boundaries, give the trust, you will be amazed. If you treat
Yeah.
people like adults, they will treat you as an adult as well. If you don't do that, I think you're going to get different outcome. I think it's very
Well,
simple, as, from a standpoint. But yeah,
oh yeah, exactly. I mean, it's even if we're bringing up a little boy at the moment, and we are often we're going through that a parental stage of kind of treat people how you want to be treated, and a lot of it stems into to organizations as well. And it's and again, you suddenly discover how people can behave when they're given that kind of freedom. We often refer to the leadership as action within impact, and we're so focusing on leadership as a particular type of action rather than a particular type of person. In fact, the very first episode of this series, we interviewed um, one of our own or ex-employees, now retired employees, who developed our leadership model. And that stems a lot around noticing, deciding, and acting. And there's more information on that one, which I won't go into too much detail now. But it essentially says that leadership can and should come from anywhere within an organization, provided, of course, that culture is there. And so my question to you would be, how would you ensure that you can build that culture of leadership, of a leadership culture that's kind of valued and prioritized within all levels of a company from a kind of an HR point of view?
well, I mean, to me, it starts with who do you want to be in terms of culture, or what culture do you espouse in an organization? It literally starts with that. The
Yeah.
other thing, and it actually, when you just were talking about your son, right, about how you're raising them, to me, setting that stage and interacting um, with people is a really important one. And there needs to be a willingness to be vulnerable in letting people in, because sometimes we use the term leadership and we always think about the C level, somebody very
Sure.
senior. But I was sort of brought up with the idea of leadership is, think about it this way. People go home and they talk about leadership. But leadership, when they refer to leadership, they're not talking about the CEO. They're
Yeah.
talking about the direct manager. So early on in somebody's journey as a people leader, you need to start, sharing, okay, this is my organization sort of view on leadership. And I mean, every company does that differently, although I think there's definitely, again, some universal principles to act upon. And I think once, and again, this is a journey for a lot of companies, and over time sometimes culture changes, but you need to really give that a lot of thought, because that's not something that comes easily. So when you say, like, how do you do that, how do you influence it, how do you create it, I'm going to say slowly and extremely carefully, and because you need to craft it and you need to be willing that it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, we always hear, right, I mean, reputations, cultures, they're built over decades and then destroyed in minutes. And I think when people think about it this way, and especially as a leader, what I do, it will be watched at every day, every minute of the day. And I'm not
Mm.
saying that you need to be on your toes all the day, but if you have that realization, like, people will have a perception of me. So I just became something else. I think if you're open to that and get that concept, it's easier for organizations to work with you to sort of mold you, and sorry for using that term, into the, okay, this is the leadership profile that we espouse, because it's different. It's very different in companies, and I've worked for a number of companies. A leadership profile in one company was extremely different compared to another, and
Yeah.
that's okay because it's tied to industry, it's tied to what are your objectives, how does the economics work. Many factors play a role, but ultimately, again, it comes down to some universal concepts and some choices that an organization makes. Like, this is the culture that I want. That's where it starts. And ultimately, right, this is my belief in terms of culture. And again, as I said, I think you need to create habits over time, start slow, but ultimately it's all about winning over one person at a time. Don't think that you all of a sudden can change 20,000 people because you said something different. You need to influence and win over one person at a time. It's literally, I think about culture and driving culture as a social movement. So it's sort of like a snowball that becomes bigger and bigger, and then it becomes easier at some point when it hits a critical mass. But in the beginning, it will take time. It will take crafting. You'll get disappointed, but that's okay as long as you're very clear. This is sort of the direction that I'm chasing.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about changing one person at a time. There was a video we used to use on certain programs, um, that showed, and it was completely unrelated to anything in the business world, but it really resonated with me, which was this, it was a video of a guy dancing at a festival, and he was dancing in, let's say, a unique way. He was clearly, he didn't care what other people thought about him, right? And and then one person went and joined him, and then another person went and joined him, and then another person went and joined him, and then a whole, but within a few seconds of this video, there's a whole mass crowd of people all dancing and just going for it, and it was just a sort of a nice analogy of what you've just talked about there. Moving kind of back to you then. What's kind of what are you working on right now? What's the best thing you're working on as a leader right now
Oh wow, the best
that
thing.
you can talk
You're
about?
really putting me on the spot here. No, no, no. I mean, I personally, so I have a couple of principles that I go by. So let me start with sort of one of the principles. I think as a leader, and especially because I'm a little bit more senior, I think at my level as a leader, you need to do three things, and you need to do those three things really well, because that will help your own teams and the organization that you're working for. And for me,
Hmm.
that's budgeting, planning, and resourcing. And it's not in that particular order. But those three elements, if you do that as a leader and use the trust that we talked about earlier to delegate certain things at your team, you'll be very successful. You do the higher
Mm.
level work, you enable your teams. And in that sense, when you say, what are you working on? What are you focusing on as a leader? I've really over time, and again, this is an evolution because when I tell people back home what I do these days, I'm in HR, most people laugh hysterically because they can't imagine that I found my calling in this. But quite frankly, I found this journey very fulfilling personally,
Yeah.
right? And the reason why I'm saying what I'm saying is, and I talked earlier briefly in the intro about, I was in the military, so it's very hierarchical. You tell people what to do. It's
Yeah.
really easy. Trust is earned. It's not given. And I've made shifts over time. And I at this point in time, because I also focusing on these three elements, I'm trying to be what I call a servient leader, right? A servient and authentic leader. And what that means is that rather than dictating, although sometimes again, dictating is not the right word, but helping people make the decisions, I want to enable people to make the decisions and they can call on me if they want some advice. But I really want people to be independent because at my level, like, why am I dealing with all the detail? And it's not because I don't want to do the work, but it's because I want to develop the people below me to do my job
Sure.
at some point in time, right? So in that sense, as a leader, I'm trying to focus on developing my people rather than seeking faults and giving them direction, right? Of course, ultimately, I will give them direction, but
Yeah.
it starts with, tell me what you think is the right answer. So that's from a work perspective. And then, I've also thought of this in a more personal manner because while I was just talking to it, I'm like, hey, that's a work alignment. But personally, in order to do that and actually be my best at work, I've also over time, and I wasn't really good at this at the if you would have asked me 5, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to give the answer that I'm about to give. But I'm also actually a little bit more selfish these days. I try to focus on myself, decompress, invest in my own physical and to a certain extent also mental well-being because that will enable
Yeah.
me again to enable my team. So I've done that also in a more targeted fashion. I've started really building certain habits. I'll give you a silly example, but previously in the past, I mean, I was exercising at night, but calls come and then really quickly, the first thing that goes is the exercise. And I flipped that, and it was difficult because I'm a night owl, but to the morning, and it's now become a routine. And if I don't do it, I actually miss it, right? So that
Mm.
investment, as they say in Latin, right, mens sana in corpore sana, that has really helped me professional as well to deliver on my own personal goal of being a
Yeah.
servient, an authentic leader, because that authentic leadership and sharing people sometimes, hey, I don't know the answer or I just don't agree, or in this case, this is the position, we want to stand behind it. I think that's extremely important. That
Yeah.
transparency will ultimately help others, in my view, right? But again, you're asking me.
Yeah. Well, I was interested there. You said you were selfish, and yet I
Mm.
would challenge that and say you're not selfish because you're doing it for the greater good. You're focusing on yourself, but you're not, because selfish often thinks that it's kind of a negative thing. But
Yeah.
and maybe that's it.
Yeah.
Maybe it just resonates. The word selfishness or selfish kind of makes it sound negative, but actually you're doing it for for the benefit of others, aren't you?
No, I do, and I mean, I've used that word, but to me, for many, many years, a lot of people feel a level of guilt
Mm.
when they let their own well-being or whatever they need to do to be better at work to sort of take over. Other people are more balanced at this, but I was
Yeah.
one of those people. I was a little bit of a workaholic, so I had real difficulty stepping back and focusing on that, right?
Yeah.
And luckily, in my case, nothing bad happened to me, so there was no cataclysmic event that all of a sudden I needed to rethink, my life, my health. But I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of people that have gone through that. And I mean, I first of all, I didn't really want to. So I actually tell myself, and I even tell the people that work for me sometimes, say, you know what, be selfish and do this. And I mean that from the best possible way. It's not like I
Of
don't
course.
care, but it's actually you being selfish at that point in time in terms of what you do for others and focus on yourself, which ultimately will help other people around. That is a level of selfishness that I wholeheartedly support, right? But
Yeah,
I get what
of course.
you're saying. It has a negative connotation, but I think everything depends on context, and if you use it that way,
Absolutely.
it's a good
Absolutely.
one.
Oh, yeah, couldn't agree more. We've reached our last question, which you may or may not be pleased to know. Which and we've kept this consistent throughout all of the episodes. Which is, if you were starting your career again, what would be the best piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
Yeah, well, let me. I think the one thing that is key, and luckily, but I mean, I've learned this especially through my life as an HR professional. To be honest,
Mm,
and looking back earlier in my career as an HR professional, I definitely made some mistakes, but I've started using a little bit more of a positive connotation to this. A mistake is an opportunity to learn, so it's actually not a mistake; it was a learning opportunity. So I would say to your question, right? I mean, don't be afraid to make mistakes, right? Because people, and typically I think, especially early in their careers, or maybe even later in their careers, towards the end of their career, they're afraid to make mistakes because of the impact that it might have. But I'm going to say, don't be afraid of that. Or rather, it's not mistakes. Don't be afraid to learn because a mistake is a learning opportunity. And I
yeah.
think if you have that mindset, you'll be fine. I mean, especially these days. I mean, people talk about learn fast, fail fast, learn fast, and I think you need to have that mindset too. Luckily, I didn't make catastrophic mistakes, I would say, but looking back, there were definitely a couple of moments where I made some calls because I was afraid of making a mistake. That in hindsight, I should have just gone for it or spoken to somebody else, and it would have never occurred. But again, I cherish those mistakes because they were great moments of learning. So
Mm.
that is sort of okay. That is the piece of advice that that I would give myself. Another one might be, I'm going to shamelessly steal this because I was when it was a number of months ago. I was watching one of the latest Harry Potter movie with my daughter,
Oh yeah.
and there was a line in that movie that I thought was like, wow, this is so good. That sort of really sort of underscores how I think about things, and it's do what is right, not what is easy. And again, if I think in terms, I'm going to connect this with the mistakes comment I just made, right? Because if you do what's easy, then you typically tend to make some mistakes. If you do what's right, yeah, okay, that might be a little bit of a tougher road, but you're not going to make that many mistakes. Although you'll
Mm.
learn some valuable life lessons as well. So I think those would be the two ones that I would sort of put out there.
Yeah, no, and they're great, and I couldn't agree more when it comes to embracing
Mm,
mistakes, or let's recall
mm.
them learning opportunities.
Opportunities.
I'm pleased to say that, and again, more organisations can embrace that culture. I think that would certainly that would certainly be good for the human element of human resources, right?
Mm,
It's that is we
mm.
are all human at the end of the
Absolutely.
day. Well, listen, thank you, Iwan, for being an amazing guest on today's episode. We've very much appreciated you taking the time to join us today, which just leaves me to say again, thank you to Iwan de Leeuw for joining us today on today's episode of In Good Company. And if you'd like to find out more about Impact, or if you'd like to connect with either of us on LinkedIn, please find all of the links that you need in the description. So it just remains for me to say thank you again to Iwan de Leeuw for joining us. And until the next time, take care. Bye bye.